The defendant in this case will now sit on Florida's death row as he awaits the death penalty. He will pay the ultimate price.
So I have considered all of the testimony and evidence, arguments of counsel, applicable case law and statutes. I have prepared a written sentencing order, which I'll file contemporaneously with the pronouncement of the sentence here today. I also have copies for the state and defense, which I'll hand out once I conclude. So in the state of Florida versus Wade Stephen Wilson, case number 19 CF 568, the court will read aloud the portion of the sentencing order related to the sentencing circumstances and proportionality. In evaluating the aggravating and mitigating factors, the court does not engage in a mere counting procedure, but instead makes a reasoned judgment based on the totality of the circumstances. In reaching this decision, the court is mindful that because death is a unique punishment in its finality, its application is reserved only for those cases where the most aggravating and least mitigating circumstances exist. The law never requires the imposition of a death sentence. In this case, the totality of the circumstances indicates the defendant, with premeditation, beat and strangled Kristine Melton in her home before stealing her vehicle and driving to meet his girlfriend, Melissa Montanez. After Montanez refused to get into the car with him, the defendant battered her in broad daylight. The defendant told law enforcement, when Ms. Montanez managed to flee from the defendant, he fled the scene and drove back to Cape Coral, where he decided that he would murder another person. He saw Diane Ruiz walking to work and pulled over, pretending to ask for directions. She got into the car to provide directions, but the defendant strangled her when she tried to exit. He then drove to an empty lot, strangling her into unconsciousness at least one additional time on the way there. When she tried to flee from the car, he drove over her at least one time, inflicting mortal injuries to her spine, ribs, and neck. The evidence showed that both murders were heinous, atrocious, and cruel, and that the second murder was cold, calculated, and premeditated. The defendant inflicted serious physical and emotional pain to the victims. Moreover, the defendant committed the murders while on probation for prior felony convictions, and he committed 2 first-degree murders contemporaneously with each other and with grand theft of a motor vehicle, battery, and burglary of a dwelling. There were no statutory mitigating circumstances that were established, but the court considered the non-statutory mitigating circumstances presented by the defendant. Out of 13 enumerated non-statutory mitigating factors, the court found that 10 had been established. Out of those established, 6 were given little weight. The totality of the mitigating circumstances indicates that the defendant suffers from drug use from a young age, along with undiagnosed and untreated mental health issues of some kind. He felt abandoned by his biological parents, but had a devoted adoptive family.
In the humid darkness of October 2019, a shadow fell over Cape Coral, Florida, that would change the city forever. It began with a vibrant woman who simply stopped answering her phone, and it ended with a discovery so brutal it defied logic. This wasn't the work of a professional hitman or a desperate thief. It was the work of a man who looked into the mirror and saw a monster. A man who shared a name with a comic book anti-hero, but who possessed a soul that was terrifyingly real. His name is Wade Wilson. By the time the sun rose, 2 women were dead, a community was paralyzed, and a father was forced to make the most agonizing phone call of his life. We often ask if evil is born or if it's made. But as we peel back the layers of this case, we find a man who didn't just stumble into darkness, he sprinted toward it, carving his malice into his own skin for the world to see. Welcome to Cold Trail Crimes. Today we are descending into one of the most chilling sagas in modern Florida history. We'll examine the evidence, the heartbreaking testimonies, and the disturbing courtroom transformation of a killer who showed no remorse, even as the shadow of the death penalty loomed over him. Before we begin the timeline of that fateful night, please take a moment to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Your support allows us to keep digging for the truth in cases that must never be forgotten. Now let's go back to the morning of October 7th, where the trail first went cold. October 7th, 2019 began like any other Monday in Southwest Florida. But for those who knew 35-year-old Kristine Melton, something felt instinctively wrong. Kristine was the kind of person who lived out loud. She was a daughter, a friend, and a beloved waitress who was known for her quick wit and her devotion to her godchildren. When she didn't show up for work and her phone went silent, the concern wasn't just a flicker, it was a forest fire. The police arrived at her duplex on Southeast 4th Street for a wellness check. Outside, the driveway was empty. Kristine's 2016 silver Nissan Sentra was gone. Inside, the silence was heavy. When officers moved toward the bedroom, they found a scene that would haunt the Cape Coral Police Department for years. Kristine was lying in her bed, still tucked under the covers as if she were sleeping. But she wasn't sleeping. She had been strangled with such force that the physical evidence left behind told a story of a terrifying, prolonged struggle. There was no sign of forced entry. This wasn't a random break-in. Kristine had been out the night before at a local bar called Buddha Live, where she had met a man. He was tall, charismatic in a dangerous sort of way, and went by the name Wade. Witnesses recalled them leaving together, but no one could have predicted that by inviting him into her home, Kristine was inviting in her own end. While investigators were still processing the DNA and the fingerprints in Kristine's bedroom, the killer was already miles away, driving her stolen car and hunting for his next opportunity. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't fleeing the state. He was wandering the streets of Cape Coral, fueled by an adrenaline that most human beings can't comprehend. Just a few hours later, and only a few miles north, 43-year-old Diane Ruiz was walking along a quiet stretch of road. Diane was a mother of two and a hard-working bartender who was simply trying to get to work. She was a woman of routine, a woman who was loved. As she walked, that silver Nissan Sentra pulled alongside her. The man behind the wheel, Wade Wilson, rolled down the window. He didn't jump out with a weapon. He used a tactic as old as time. He asked for directions. It was a moment of simulated vulnerability that lured Diane close enough for him to reach out. According to Wilson's later statements, the moment she got close, he attacked. What followed wasn't just murder. It was an exhibition of cruelty. Wilson strangled Diane until she lost consciousness. But he didn't stop there. He pushed her out of the stolen car and onto the pavement. As he looked at her lying there, he realized she was still breathing. In a move that shocked even veteran homicide detectives, Wilson got back behind the wheel and drove the car over her body, repeatedly. He later told investigators he ran her over until she looked like spaghetti. By noon that day, two families were shattered, but the police didn't even know the two cases were connected yet. They had a missing person in Diane Ruiz and a homicide scene at Kristine Melton's duplex. As the sun began to set over the Gulf, the man responsible was already looking for his next audience, beginning a series of phone calls that would eventually lead to his undoing. The hunt for a killer usually involves a complex web of forensic data and digital breadcrumbs, but the capture of Wade Wilson followed a much more intimate path of betrayal. As the bodies of Kristine Melton and Diane Ruiz lay cold, Wade didn't retreat into the shadows. Instead, he reached out to the one person he thought might understand the darkness inside him, his biological father, Stephen Testaseca. The phone calls that followed were nothing short of a descent into madness. Stephen sat in his home, miles away, listening to his son's voice crackle over the line. But there was no panic in Wade's tone, no plea for help, and certainly no remorse. He was bragging. He told his father about the two people who are gone, describing the killings with a casual, almost rhythmic detachment. He spoke about the sensation of the life leaving his victims' bodies, and he specifically detailed the horrific way he had used the car to finish what his hands had started with Diane Ruiz. Imagine the weight of that moment for a parent. Stephen Testaseca was caught in the ultimate moral vice. This was his flesh and blood, a son he had been estranged from for years, now confessing to being a monster. But Stephen didn't hesitate. As Wade continued to call, Stephen was secretly coordinating with the authorities. He became the bait, keeping his son on the line, coaxing out details of his location while detectives traced the signal. Wade's journey during these hours was erratic. He had surfaced at the home of an ex-girlfriend, Melissa Montanez, where the violence continued. He didn't kill her, but he beat her with a ferocity that served as a grim foreshadowing of what he was capable of when his temper flared. By the time police closed in, Wade had abandoned Kristine's silver Nissan and was attempting to blend into the city he had just traumatized. The arrest itself was almost an anticlimax compared to the violence of the day. On October 8th, less than 24 hours after the first body was discovered, police swarmed a location in Lee County. Wade Wilson was taken into custody without the cinematic shootout he might have expected. But it was the first mugshot that truly signaled the beginning of the media circus. At the time, Wade had a few tattoos, but his face was largely recognizable, a handsome, if somewhat troubled, young man. However, as he sat in the interrogation room, the mask began to slip. He was disturbingly cooperative, laying out the timeline of the murders with a flat affect, a psychological term for a complete lack of emotional response. He spoke about the murders as if he were recounting a trip to the grocery store. Even behind bars, Wade wasn't done. While awaiting trial, he attempted a daring escape in 2020 by tampering with a window in his cell, a plan that was only foiled when another inmate alerted the guards. It was during these years of delays and legal maneuvering that the Wade Wilson the world would come to fear truly began to emerge. He began to use his face as a canvas, covering himself in symbols of hate and macabre imagery, effectively erasing the man who had committed the crimes and replaced him with a living monument to his own malice. As the legal proceedings moved at a glacial pace, a secondary horror began to unfold within the walls of the Lee County Jail. This is the period where Wade Wilson transitioned from a common criminal into a viral nightmare. Most defendants are advised by their lawyers to look as presentable as possible, to appear human, relatable, and remorseful. Wade did the exact opposite. He began to use his own skin as a manifesto. Over the 4 years leading up to his trial, Wilson's face disappeared behind a mask of ink. He added swastikas under his eyes, a skeletal grin stitched across his mouth, and jagged symbols of white supremacy across his neck and scalp. This wasn't just jailhouse boredom, it was a deliberate shedding of his humanity. By the time he walked into the courtroom, he had transformed himself into a caricature of a monster, ensuring that no juror could look at him without feeling an instinctive sense of dread. But to understand the man behind the ink, we have to look back at the trail of red flags that the system failed to catch. Wade Wilson didn't just wake up one morning and decide to become a spree killer. His history was a roadmap of escalating aggression. In 2015, he was accused of a brutal sexual battery, a case that eventually saw him acquitted but left a trail of traumatized victims in its wake. He had a rap sheet that included battery, grand theft, and kidnapping. Time and again, he had been processed through the revolving door of the justice system, receiving slaps on the wrist for behavior that screamed of a deep-seated sociopathy. Psychologists who examined him noted a recurring theme: an absolute lack of empathy combined with an insatiable need for dominance. He didn't kill for money, and he didn't kill out of passion. He killed for the sake of the act itself. This was evidenced by his behavior in jail while awaiting trial. In 2020, he wasn't just content with his escape attempt. He was reportedly involved in a conspiracy to smuggle drugs and was eventually hospitalized after an intentional overdose. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this period was the Wade Wilson fan club. Despite the gruesome details of the murders, Wilson began receiving thousands of letters from women across the country. They sent him money, they sent him photos, and they pleaded for his release. It was a textbook case of hybristophilia, the attraction to those who commit outrageous crimes. Wilson played into it, basking in the attention, showing that even from a 6-by-9-foot cell, he could still manipulate and exert power over others. This act of the story isn't just about the crimes he committed, but about the persona he built to shield himself from the reality of his actions. He wanted the world to see a demon because a demon doesn't have to feel guilt. He was preparing for his final stage, the courtroom, where he would attempt to turn a double murder trial into a dark piece of performance art. In June 2024, the eyes of the nation turned to a courtroom in Lee County. This wasn't just a trial. It was a confrontation with a man who had spent 5 years turning himself into a visual nightmare. When Wade Wilson walked into that room, the air seemed to leave it. The handsome young man from the 2019 mugshot was gone, replaced by a tattooed specter who looked more like a horror movie villain than a defendant. but the prosecution was determined to ensure the jury looked past the ink and focused on the blood. The trial was a grueling display of forensic reality. The state didn't just present evidence, they built a wall of truth that Wilson could not climb over. We heard from the medical examiners who laid out the sheer brutality of the deaths. They described the manual pressure applied to Kristine Melton, a clinical term for a terrifying, intimate struggle for air. Then came the harrowing details of Diane Ruiz's final moments. The jury was shown photos of the injuries consistent with being run over repeatedly, a testament to a level of cruelty that the prosecution labeled as heinous, atrocious, and cruel. The legal standard in Florida for the death penalty. One of the most powerful moments came when Melissa Montanez took the stand. She was the woman who had survived him. As she recounted the beating she endured between the two murders, the courtroom was silent. Her survival was the only thing that broke his streak of lethality, and her testimony provided a window into the raw, unprovoked rage that fueled him. Through it all, Wade Wilson sat at the defense table, and his behavior was nothing short of chilling. He smirked. He leaned back in his chair with an air of boredom. He even appeared to yawn during some of the most graphic testimonies. It was a final, silent insult to the families sitting just a few feet away, the Meltons and the Ruizes, who were forced to relive the worst days of their lives while the man responsible treated it like a tedious chore. The defense tried to argue that Wilson's brain was addled by drugs, suggesting he wasn't in his right mind during the spree, but the prosecution countered with the cold, hard facts of his phone calls to his father. Those calls weren't the ramblings of a confused man, they were the boasts of a man who knew exactly what he had done and was proud of it. The jury didn't take long. On June 12th, the verdict came back. Guilty on all counts, including 2 counts of first-degree murder. But in Florida, the verdict is only half the battle. Then came the penalty phase. Under the state's updated laws, a unanimous jury is no longer required for a death recommendation. The tension was suffocating as the jury handed down their decision. A recommendation of death for the murder of Kristine Melton with a 9-3 vote, and a recommendation of death for Diane Ruiz with a 10-2 vote. The final word belonged to Judge Nicholas Thompson. In August 2024, as he handed down the formal death sentence, he looked at Wilson, who stood there with the same indifferent expression he'd worn for weeks, and affirmed that these crimes were cold, calculated, and premeditated. The Deadpool killer was officially headed to death row. As the courtroom cleared and the media circus moved on to the next headline, the heavy iron doors of Florida's Union Correctional Institution closed behind Wade Wilson. He now occupies a cell on death row, a place where time slows down, and the tattoos he used to intimidate the world will slowly fade in the dim light of a high-security wing. But the story of this case doesn't end with a sentence. It ends with the echoes left behind in the lives of those he tried to erase. For the families of Kristine Melton and Diane Ruiz, justice is a heavy word. It doesn't bring back the sound of Kristine's laughter or the comfort of Diane's presence at the dinner table. Diane's sons are now grown men who had to watch their mother's killer smirk in a courtroom while they carried the weight of her absence. Kristine's friends still have to pass the duplex, where a night of fun turned into a nightmare. We often focus on the killer, the tattoos, the phone calls, the Deadpool moniker. But that is exactly what a man like Wade Wilson wants. He wants to be a legend of malice. By shifting our focus back to the victims, we strip him of that power. We remember Kristine not as a body in a bed, but as a woman who was a light to her godchildren. We remember Diane not as spaghetti on a road, but as a mother who worked 2 jobs to provide a future for her boys. The cold trail of Wade Wilson reminds us that evil isn't always a shadow in the woods. Sometimes it's a man with a charming smile asking for directions. It reminds us that the justice system is a slow, grinding machine, but one that eventually catches up to those who think they are above humanity. Wade Wilson will eventually face his final day, not as a comic book villain, but as a man who threw away his life to take others. Until then, his name serves as a grim warning of the darkness that can hide behind a familiar face. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into one of Florida's most haunting cases. If you found this investigation insightful, please give this video a like and share it to help us grow. We want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think the 2024 verdict brought true closure to Cape Coral? Or are the scars too deep to heal? For more deep dives into the cases that defy explanation, stay tuned to Cold Trail Crimes. I'm your narrator, and we'll see you on the next trail.